Okay, so I guess, yeah. So I should say, so I'm Neil Lawrence. I'm at Amazon at the moment, but I'm at University of Sheffield, and my thinking on this is all to do with my academic hat on, not to do with Amazon's hat on. So just to sort of make that clear. So the idea of data trusts is a mechanism to try and deal with the fact that nowadays we're all laying down data, personal data, in all our activities. Everything we're doing, we're sort of leaking data. And decisions are being made on the basis of that personal data. So those decisions are often not very consequential. So they may just be that you get certain adverts presented to you, or it may be just about a newsfeed ranking that you get. But when accumulated together, these decisions can have a very significant effect on your lives. In fact, they're sort of changing the environment around you. So if you look at most legislation that currently exists around data, and the GDPR dates back to the sort of early 1980s, so people don't quite realize how long that legislation's been cooking for. It's actually much more directed towards what they call consequential decisions. So most of our rights under the GDPR are rights that occur when a significant decision is being made against us. So that may be something to do with loans or a university admission. But the new phenomena is that there's a series of inconsequential decisions that together have a consequential effect on our lives. And sort of current legislation isn't dealing with this at all. Do we have the slides now, or are we... Bear with us for 2 seconds.
Okay, I will continue then. So given that the situation is we are leaking data on a daily basis, and this leaves us... Yay! This leaves us vulnerable. Okay, keyword here is vulnerable. Now, how do we regain control? Yeah, so a lot of us, even people who are very well informed about the data, feel that there's not much they can do. They're just bombarded with these notice and consent windows, and we feel like we have to click to get this window to get it away. How do I control the slides, by the way? Yeah.
Oh, there's a clicker. There we go.
So that was the problem. This leaves us vulnerable. Now, is the solution lying in the concept of ownership? Well, the short answer is no, but I'll explain why. So a lot of people intuitively believe that in order to regain control of something, if we can just get ownership of that thing, then we have control. And this association between ownership on one hand and control on the other hand is often rooted in a very old saying one's home is one's castle, right? And of course, data is unlike homes and unlike castles, okay? If data can give rise to property rights, and I think in some cases it can, these rights are more like the rights that someone may have in a river that runs through their land. Yeah? So when you have a river that runs through your land, you have to take into account the rights of the people upstream, the rights of the people downstream, and the rights of the people on either side of the river. Now, that means non-exclusive rights. And that means that actually you don't have that much control, even if you own that river. And that the same applies, I think, to data. Ownership is not just a poor answer. It's not just an unlikely answer to the problem at stake. It's also a poor answer given the vulnerabilities at stake. So, to you, Neil.
So yeah, as we were saying earlier, that I mean, apart from being a terrible name, General Data Protection Regulation, a lot of the sentiments in it are good. And the original conventions were actually protection of individuals as pertaining to their personally private data, which is much more the spirit of the thing. But this does not reverse the power asymmetry between data controllers and data subjects. And the analogy I like to use here is, if you look at our environment around data today, it's very akin to the feudal world. So if you go back in history to the Middle Ages, there were sort of two things going on if you lived in a feudal village. There was, you had your bit of land, you had to provide a tithe, and that was to a lord. You couldn't actually move away from that land, and they had a duty of care over you to protect you and your family. But if they failed in that duty of care over you, you had no sort of comeback. because there was a power asymmetry between the lord that owned the manor and you as an individual. You then had the commons, but that's subject to the tragedy of the commons. So the commons are great, free for all on the commons, but not all your data is suitable for the commons. And the sort of relationship between us and data controllers, data subjects is a wonderful word, because we are subjects almost like under the royal prerogative of the lord of the manor in terms of that data relationship. If we have a challenge, if we want to do something with that challenge, we have a power asymmetry that we can't go. Even the GDPR, it's great, so we have rights under that, but to exercise those rights against a very powerful entity that's controlling a lot of data for us as an individual is very, very challenging. So this gives a notion which arises, which is what leads to data trust, is that you need some kind of additional entity, a sort of third way of doing things. And what got rid of feudalism is democracy. Now, democracy isn't perfect, as we know very well, but what you have with a democratic entity, if the controller of the data is democratically elected, is that they have some need to be aligned with the individuals who are in their group. So that was the driving notion for this type of idea, that you need a third player in that game, someone who is worried about the data subjects, not in the way that a sort of paternalistic care for the data subjects, I'm a royal, I'm going to look after them, but worried because if those data subjects are upset, they're going to sort of apply pressure back up.
Great. So the solution. The solution is we propose to use trust, the legal mechanism of trust law, to empower data subjects, that's us, to take the reins of our data. Now, that means that in trust law, one of the key roles is played by the data trustee. Yeah? So a trustee has an undivided obligation of undivided loyalty towards the beneficiaries and the settlers. So what happens when you set up a trust is you have some people, the settlers, who want to put something in a trust. And we'll come back to this something, because this something actually could be just rights, okay? But so you put something in a trust, and the trustee has an obligation to manage that thing according to the terms of the trust. And the trustee has to do so, it's very important, with an obligation of undivided loyalty. And that means that there cannot be any appearance of, conflicts, divided loyalties between the fact that the trustees say could have to help the beneficiaries and also report, say, to shareholders. That's not going to work. So this undivided loyalty condition is important because we believe that this is what makes it possible and viable to address the very considerable vulnerabilities that are at stake when we share our data online. Okay.
So that's great, but there's another issue here, which is what we would really like is the constitutional terms of these trusts to reflect individuals' aspirations. And that's a challenge. So the challenge, so if you bring up something like the idea of a social contract in front of Sylvie, she twitches a little bit. Because the problem with the notion of a social contract is it presumes that we all know how we want our futures to be and that we're going to agree that today uniformly across the whole country and that future generations will be subject to that. So what's very important in this model is that you have an ecosystem of these trusts. So you have the ability to shop around. So different data trusts, their constitutional terms should reflect what the aspirations of their members would want to be. So some people just want to make money out of their data. Some people maybe want to use their data for medical benefit. These different things, you'll see a spectrum of opinions about how people feel their data should be treated. And I really don't think, I think we both don't think, that the world is in a position to know which of those opinions is right or to pass judgment on that. So what we believe is that you need an ecosystem of these trusts, each of them set up to pursue a particular way people expect that we should be, but people should also be able to move between trusts. So if a trust isn't working out for you because you've changed the way you want your life to be, you could move your data to another trust and they would manage it in a different way. Kind of like, almost like the ability, if your democracy isn't quite working out for you in your country, to sort of move your data to another country and have it managed according to a democracy you prefer.
So there are 4 conditions for a proposal to work. Our proposal is then to use trust law as a way of empowering people to take the reins of their data. First condition, the barrier for entry must be low. What do we mean by that? Well, it needs to be not fairly easy, but it needs to be accessible. It needs to be possible for someone to set up a trust together with other people without there being too many hurdles, whether they're financial or legal. The second condition is data subjects' data must be secure. That sounds obvious, but it's not always easy to make sure that that's verified. And here I should specify that in our model, we could have very different ways of implementing this data trust ID. And some data trusts may decide that they don't want to pull the data from wherever it is. Yeah? The data may stay wherever it is, wherever it is, and not be centralized in a trust. That's important. The third condition is an individual's personal data must be erasable from any particular system. Yeah? So if you care about the fact that people should be able to choose among different trusts and switch trust when needed, you need both the erasure condition, which is provided in Europe by Article 17 of GDPR. In the US now we have the CCPA that provides something not quite the same, but it gets there. And then the fourth condition is an individual's personal data must be portable between different computer systems. Now, I should state, of course, and because I can see some people already moving their heads in a lateral way, that, that these rights are limited, no question. So at the moment, the rights to erasure, the rights to portability are, in fact, quite severely limited as they are granted by the GDPR. And the same applies, the same limitations roughly apply in the CCPA. Now, I believe that if it were to see light of day, our data trust proposal could contribute to more debate and possibly more pressure to make those rights less restricted. Yes? So this is something that can grow and evolve as data trusts take root.
So yeah, well, this is, I guess, more the technical legal
Yes,
point.
okay.
I can have a go at it.
Sure, yeah, you have a go.
What's fascinating about this is you dive deep in these things, lawyers emerge from the woodwork and start saying stuff at you, which are technical legal points. So there's some really interesting technical legal points that I'll try and get across.
Right.
So trusts are set up to hold things in a trust. But there's the best legal opinion is what a trust holds is rights to things, not property itself. So if I have property, I have a right to access that property, and I can put those rights within a trust. Now, what gets super interesting here and doesn't seem to be clarified at all now I'm super interested in this, but it's a really legal technical point. But I do find it fascinating. Let me phrase it this way. Certain rights are not, we don't like the word assignable, mandatable.
Yes.
Certain rights you cannot hand over to people. So fundamental human rights, you just can't give over to someone else and have them act on them on your behalf, right? Whereas rights around a contract, you can share in a trust, no problem. So there's a very interesting technical legal point about whether GDPR is giving such rights as fundamental human rights, or it's giving them more as contractual rights, which is sort of untested and unexplored and arises not just for data trusts, but for contracts around data. And that's a sort of interesting, really technical legal point. But I think it was also sort of, oh yeah, so are my data rights fundamental human rights? Or are my data rights just rights a bit more like property rights?
Exactly. So I think we're going to speak about this a bit more after we've finished our spiel. But I have to say, this is actually, so there's considerable debate today about the extent to which data actually gives rise to property rights. Yeah? And I would say the emergent answer is to say that some kinds of data give rise to some kinds of property rights. Okay. But actually that debate is not necessary nor crucial to our proposal. Why? Because, and please remember this is the crucial point, we don't need to have something called property at the heart of a trust. All you need are rights. Okay? That's really important. Okay. Oh yes, I suppose that's my turn. Yeah, my turn. Yeah, actually, that's just it's a bit of a reaction, actually, to some arguments that have been made recently, which try to propose the model of data trust, saying, you know what, it's a bit complicated to use trust law, let's use contractual or corporate frameworks instead. And here, I think we both feel strongly that this would be a great shame. Why? Because actually, trust law is special for many reasons. But one of the reasons why trust law is special is that it involves different standards. Both it reverses the burden of proof, but that's a technical point. But more, I like this quote, which says, equity employs ex post moral standards, emphasizes good faith and notice, couches its reasoning in terms of morals, and is sometimes vague rather than bright line. I think it's just a nice way of illustrating why we think trust law is a very apt tool in this particular context where vulnerabilities are very considerable. Okay.
Yeah, and I should say, to be clear, I don't think we think there's lots of other ways of doing data sharing. And they're all very interesting, data collaboratives and so on and so forth. But if you're going to use the term data trusts, don't use it for something that is not using trust law. Call it something else. And where personal data is at stake, we believe the sort of increased standard of duty of care, the fiduciary duty, the undivided loyalty is critical for the data trustees to be doing their job in the right way.
Oh, and I should say also that it's very important to understand that this data trust proposal is always meant to be complementary to any existing regulatory framework. Okay, very clearly, data trusts are not meant to replace top-down interventions, top-down regulation. They're meant to be a complement that basically says, okay, we also need bottom-up empowerment structures. And that's what the data trust proposal we are putting forward here is trying to do. Now, implementation challenges. We could say there are 4. It's a bit arbitrary, but there are 4. One is, people will tell me, okay, but what about the fact that trust law only, well, is well developed here in the UK, but what about civil jurisdictions? What about France? What about other countries? The short answer is that actually the elements of trust law, so the functions that different offices in trust law fulfill, can be fulfilled by equivalent concepts in other countries. So in other words, you can rely on this trust law proposal even in jurisdictions that do not rely on equity law or trust law. I'm not going to go into the details, but effectively, we are confident that this is possible. Yes, that's the first implementation challenges. Uptake. Now, of course, it is the case that while most people here will be well aware of the fact that when they go online, they leak data, and that makes us vulnerable, most people have a very low level of awareness when it comes to their data. Most people don't even realize that they're leaking data on a daily basis. So one of the problems we're going to face, and it is a very important problem, which I hope we'll discuss as well, is how do we make sure that our proposal is not just there to empower the least vulnerable part of the population, that's us. Instead, how do we make sure that our proposal can truly serve and empower those people who have a very low level of awareness and who are, in fact, most vulnerable when it comes to the disclosure of the data. That's implementation challenges that can be addressed by, for instance, the fact that we need both public and private initiatives, and I think there's a big role to play here for governmental or local initiatives that are driven by public concerns. Now, the third implementation challenge is exit procedures. So when I want to leave the trust, how do the trustee decide what data I need to go away with? Yeah? That is a challenge. Why? Because, of course, some of my data will, for instance, be social media feeds. And in my social media feeds, I include data of other people. So how do you disentangle shared provenance data? Now, that is a problem that is not unique to our proposal. It's a problem that many people already face today, and we're not going to try and reinvent the wheel in this context. But I think there are ways of addressing it, for instance, in the terms of the trust. When you sign up to the trust, a procedure could be set up. You, yeah.
I guess...
Yes. Yes.
Well, that's more on the shared provenance issue,
right.
Which I guess we can also explore. Is that the last one, right?
There's one more after that, yeah, which is also shared provenance.
So yeah, we can. I think maybe we can explore that more with Martin in discussion. Yes, but shared provenance is clearly a problem. We're certainly not resolving that problem, but I would say what I find interesting about this idea is with an ecosystem of these, different trusts could propose different resolutions at the initial outset, and those that were more successful would tend to propagate over time. So it's a great way of exploring different ways of doing that as well.
Yeah. Well, conclusion, Yeah, there's a cool parallel here. Did you know that trust law was created all the way back in the 14th century because of a problem that crusaders faced? When crusaders went all the way to the Middle East, they came back and often they found that they couldn't get back the title to their land because according to common law, they had lost possession of their land. And so there was a lack of remedies for those crusaders. And that's what led to the creation of trust law. Now, interestingly, here, we're trying to get away from a medieval way of governing data. But we're also facing the fact that there's a lack of remedies for us, people, data subjects, in the sense that, yes, we have very important regulation like the GDPR, which is essential, and we are fans. People sometimes misunderstand our data trust proposal as something that tries to eclipse or lower the importance of the GDPR. Not at all. It's absolutely reliant on the GDPR, but it's saying that cannot be the beginning and end of the answer. We also need bottom-up empowerment structures that enable us to make choices about what risks and what responsibilities we are comfortable with when it comes to our data. We each have different risk thermometers. Yeah? We feel differently about what is okay when it comes to releasing our data in the public sphere and what is not. And at the moment, there is not many ways of making meaningful choices about how our data should be shared and governed. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to... So before starting the next session, I'm just going to ask you one question, which has been puzzling me quite a bit about this approach. I think the approach is very exciting, nonetheless, because in some of the unintended consequences that we've seen about the impact of technology on us and our societies, especially over the past few years, we've seen that these unintended consequences fall hardest on the most marginalized in society. Now, you asked a question, but I'm going to push you a little bit more on that. Are the bottom-up data trusts a really exciting vehicle for collective action where people who are more marginalized in society can get together and create data trusts that reflect their aspirations and goals and therefore gain more power, right? And reverse some of that power asymmetry that we're seeing in societies right now between, for example, large technology platforms and marginalized communities. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, are the bottom-up data trusts, could they effectively become a tool to further empower the already empowered in society? I'm making up the percentages, but the 5 or 7% of people who care deeply about these issues, all of the people in this room right now who'll understand the mechanics of the trusts and be able to really delve into the detail. So in mentioning the question, you said that we need to set up different some public ventures and some private ones, but what are your thoughts on that? So if you could answer that in a couple of minutes, and then we'll go to the broader one. But it strikes me that that's a fundamental issue when it comes to, or one of the fundamental issues when it comes to the trusts.
So a meta point on that question, and then maybe I'll pass to Sylvie. I'm so excited that you asked that question, because effectively you're asking a question about data democracy. Because we could apply what you've just asked to the way we've set up different democracies across Europe. Some democracies entrench more power of establishment in Parliament. You could do proportional representation, you could do first past the post, and others sort of do different things. Some push more extremism in the democracy, and some push more compromise in the democracy. So the very fact that that question comes up means we've sort of made progress in our thinking towards something where, now we have levers to tune to try and shift that balance between minority representation in the data trusts ecosystem, or the reputation of more established, status quo within the data trust ecosystem. How you turn those screws is an interesting question and a very, very hard one, so I'm going to pass it to Sylvie.
Well, I think one thing that perhaps we haven't broached yet is the fact that we feel that the reason why we insist on the fact that there should be a variety of trust and that people should be able to choose between trust and switch when needed. Why do we insist on that? Well, the reason for this is that we believe that unless there are meaningful choices to be made about how we govern our data, and these choices need to be made by us, then the debate is is not going to really flourish. The debate is not going to grow as much as it could. And so the idea is that by creating a situation where everybody needs to make some kind of choice about how our data is governed, this will make it more likely, at least, that a true debate will flourish about data and how we should govern it. And once you have more debate, hopefully you have more awareness as well, including in the people who, at the moment, do not have much awareness at all about the data. That's an idea. It, of course, relies on hopeful assumptions about the fact that there'll be more debate and hence more awareness. But I think it's of value, the fact that by creating an ecosystem of data trust, suddenly it's not all about top-down regulation where some people in government or local structures choose for us. It's also about us, people with all our diverse opinions about data, choosing and maybe discussing among ourselves what are the right choices.
But all of our people, with all our diverse views on data, some of us may have very extreme views on it.
Right.
So can I set up, or maybe not me, but can someone set up a data trust for purposes that people may find to be ill purposes, to be negative purposes? Because part of this discussion, we've been involved for a long time in the civic tech community, and the civic tech community, civic technology community 10 years ago was very sort of, the platform will empower you, these tools are awesome, they're neutral, they will create sort of progressive values in the world. And then obviously what we saw over the past 10 years is that then those tools were used for purposes for which the founders were very much sort of, against, sort of more progressive founders may be very against. So can you set up a data trust to sort of, turn your country into an authoritarian regime? Who guards against that?
I thought it was a really good question because I thought about it and I thought, okay, initially you could just say, it could be created for ill purposes, but we need an oversight body and that's fine. But then I thought a bit more and I said, actually, I struggled to come up with one example of a trust that could really be pushing for evil purposes. But why? Because actually, there's one interesting obligation. It's the fact that the trustee, the data trustee in this case, needs to make sure that whatever data is brought to the trust is in fact the set loss to give. So I'll explain this. So let's take a very controversial example, the Sidewalks Labs example. Okay. Now this is in the news a lot. Why is it in the news?
Can you explain the example a little bit?
Oh, yes, okay. So, I suppose it's Google or a subsidiary of Google is proposing to build a very smart city that can collect data ambiently. But it can do that, and they say, don't worry about concerns about privacy, etc. We are going to create a data trust. So this data will be kept secure and, will address privacy concerns. Now, the worry I have, and I think a lot of people are worried about this proposal, is that actually this data, the data that is collected in this smart city, is not theirs to give. The data is the people's data. And so what I'm trying to say here is that this is an important constraint, is that when you create a trust, the trustee would be under an obligation to make sure that the data that is brought into the trust is in fact okay to be given. Right. And that is an important constraint because it does mean that if you're exercising the rights of people for the benefit of the people who've set up the trust, it's quite hard, actually, to set up a trust for truly ill purposes.
We were brainstorming a bit about this type of question on the train, and the example where you see it happening in existing society is when people are under some form of social obligation and they're using mechanisms of trusts to avoid that social obligation by transporting assets abroad to a region where they're avoiding that social obligation. So I guess the example I could think of is if there was a social obligation associated with data, and you were collectivizing your data together and putting it somewhere else and using it in that way. And such a social obligation we might over time, I don't think we should decide this immediately, but over time it might become clear that there should be a social obligation on our health data. People talk about that. I think having that immediately might be wrong, but over time it might be clear, no, we really should have that. Equivalent of a sort of tax on your health data to share health across the country. And maybe you could use your trust to avoid that. But the advantages aren't quite there so much because in the case of financial trusts, it's because you have so much more money than everyone else that it's worth your interests to do this. But in data, you would have to have a lot more illness or something. It would be a bit tragic. than everyone else to acquire all this data. I mean, the value isn't really there because it's a sort of interesting difference between money and data is, your data has to be accumulated with others and you can't, well, you can acquire other people's data, but if you're controlling your personal data, it doesn't work quite so well.
Okay, so I think huge amount of questions there. Nonetheless, a lot of this resides on the notion of the data trustee and creating that class. So what we're going to do is we're going to thank Neil and Sylvie, spice it up a bit and bring others on. And thank you very much.